And I see that our numbers of participants have paused. So I think that means that everybody has been able to enter into the Zoom room. So I'm really pleased to welcome you all to our second seminar in the Trobe Asia's academic seminar series, India in Focus. My name is Beck Strading. I'm the Executive Director of La Trobe Asia. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the elders of the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which La Trobe University sits, and pay my respect to their people, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians who might be watching this seminar today. Now, I'm thrilled to introduce our second speaker for this series, Dr. Ruth Gamble, who is an ARC DECRA Fellow in the Trobe Department of Archaeology and History, as well as a lecturer in history. Ruth is a historian of Tibet and the Himalaya, and she has a particular interest in this region's rapidly changing environment. Welcome, Ruth. It's terrific to have you here today.
Hi, Beck.
Now, throughout the seminar, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function, and I'll call on people when we get to the Q&A period to ask Ruth their questions directly. For now, I'm going to hand it over to Ruth to present for around 40 minutes or so. So thank you, Ruth.
Thanks, Beck. Thanks for inviting me, and hello, everybody. Coming to you from lockdown Melbourne, also known as Nam, and as Beck said, I'm also coming to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects also to their elders and extend that respect to any First Nations people who may be listening here today. Today I was going to tell you, basically I'm going to tell you a story, but it's maybe a well-worn tale, but a tale that I'm going to try and tell in a little bit of a different way, right? So I'm just going to share my screen so you can see. I've been trying to get you some pictures to have a look at, so you didn't just have to look at my haggard lockdown face. So the story I wanted to tell you today is about when India and China fought a war in 1962, but I don't want to specifically focus on that war because which I guess is probably means the title sounds a bit strange, but actually how that we got into that war and what the lingering effects of that have been. That's the story I wanted to tell. And I'm going to do this from a bit of a different. Well, first of all, I'll tell you the basics of the war because I don't know who's listening and I don't know how much people know about it. So just to give you an overview of what happened in the Sino-Indian War of 1962. It's a strange one because it didn't actually last that long, but I want to argue today that there was a really long lead in and there's a long lead out. And the actual month or so of the war isn't the most interesting part, I'd say, of this story, right? So the war itself, the Sino-Indian War, lasted from the 20th of October to the 21st of November in 1962. It's not a lot. It's not a very long time at all. And it was fought along two spheres or two areas of the Himalaya in the west. In the border of Jammu and Kashmir in an area called Ladakh and Aksai Chin, and in the east along the border of what China calls Sangnan and India calls Arunachal Pradesh, in two Himalayan theaters of war. Right. There's a lot of every time India and China seem to fight, there's arguments about how many people were involved and how many people died. But the top estimate of those who died in this month-long war was 6,197. They agree on how many prisoners of war there were, 3,968, and there were a majority of those were from the Indian side. There were 80,000 Chinese soldiers involved and only 22,000 Indian soldiers. China basically won. They crossed over into what India considered its territory in both spheres, in both theaters, and then they unilaterally withdrew, right? So the war didn't end up really resolving anything. What we were left with on both sides of the mountains, both sides of their borders, was what's called a line of actual control, which isn't the same thing as a border. It's a designation that no one can agree on, and then therefore no one can move past. So yeah, thanks to Al Jazeera makes the best maps. So I just have to do a shout out to them as I try and explain that to you. So we're left with this geopolitical situation that continues today from that time, and a unstable situation in both the northeast of India and the south, in the very far west of China, and the northeast of India, northwest and northeast. And there's two areas that are create particular tensions. One of them is called the Aksai Chin, which is a high level plain that is adjacent or within the what was the area of India of Jammu and Kashmir. And then there's another area that's almost an entire state by itself called Arunachal Pradesh. And then there's also other areas along the border between the two, the little areas where no one can agree on where the actual border is, but they don't tend to fight over them as much. So that's in Sikkim and in Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh. So the way that I want to approach this topic today is not from the perspective of, you know, here is the how the war progressed, and these are the opposing arguments for who should really own this territory. Yeah, so there's an argument from China and there's an argument from India, and there's people that say, oh, I've looked at all the data and China should own it, or I've looked at all the data and India should own it. And I don't think, as a historian, it basically comes down to who has the armies on the ground. Neither of them have all historical claims are a bit dubious. So I wanted to approach it from a different perspective, and in doing so, I just wanted to start by acknowledging that I know that armies and there's a lot of people have a lot of emotion and have a lot of commitment to these nationalist causes. And it can sound a bit dismissive if I say, listen, I don't want to talk about it from the perspective of who was right and who was wrong, and the nationalist emotions involved in it. But I kept reflecting on this a lot lately. This is a picture of me a long time ago. I was living in Dharamshala in India in 2002 when there was a border skirmish between India and Pakistan, and that's me with my mates, and we were in lockdown at that point because we weren't allowed to leave the house in case there were going to be clashes, and the Australian government actually sent people in to tell us to go home. And I was reflecting on it, I was thinking, I've never been in lockdown so much, and I was like, oh, actually I was in 2002, and these are my lovely mates that I was helping them with their homework. I'm still helping people with homework 20 years later, bloomin' heck. Anyway, we were stuck there, but we weren't stuck there for long. And it occurred to me that the problems between these borders can easily, if you get the right people on the ground and talking to each other, they can much more easily be resolved than the kind of issues that I'm going to look at today, which I think led into the war and lead out of the war. And I'm taking this kind of a random approach, I guess. And that is, I spent a lot of time in the Himalaya working with veterinarians, and I don't mean veterans, but veterinarians. And they have this idea that they talk about of One Health approaches to these environments. And that is, if you want to see how things are going to work, you need to look at how humans are thriving, human health. So that is what is their diet, their social determinants, their population movements. You also need to look at climate health and the environmental health, including climate and water and pollution and deforestation, and also animal health and how animals are thriving in these environments. And there's also a link between how all of these work, right? So I was thinking about it's like, we're not locked down because of a tense war type situation here. We're locked down because partially we haven't dealt with how to live in some of these environments. This little friend over here on the bottom left-hand corner in this photo is the palm civet, which some of you may know from earlier expeditions into our news for creating coffee. That's how I first heard of him, and also producing zoonotic diseases. And above them is a takin, which I put the picture in because basically it's cute. But I wanted to have the picture of the civet in there because when I was living in the mountains, I met a civet before I actually knew that civets existed. And that was a completely trippy experience. I was like, it's a cat, but it's a possum, what's going on? And I just wanted to put the image there because it speaks to the diversity that you find in these spaces and the connections that people have between animals and humans and environments, and how actually it's the balance and the influence from this region that will have more impact on us in the long run than arguments about borders, right? So that's basically my thesis for this. So I'm just going to expand on that a little bit. So we need to understand then, like, what's going on in this space and how these arguments over borders and this really short-run war can continue to have such a important influence on the region. So basically, I know this is, if anyone does, in any of Beck's students are here, or anyone who does IR, they're going to think this is boring as, and I'm teaching you how to suck eggs. But just wanted to get back to basics here. So what do we mean by war? And war is usually an armed conflict between states, paramilitaries, and societies. And we had all of these in these ongoing tensions along the border. And there's also an interesting thing that was happening here, though, because the Sino-Indian War was part of a larger decolonizing project where you after World War II, you had places all around the world establishing their borders and talking about developing it's like self-governance, and that led to what we have now, which is this state-centered world order instead of an empire-based world order. And this war was a part of that. But the irony of it is that in order to establish themselves as post-colonial states, both India and China colonized new territories in the Himalaya that had not been part of their governance area before then. And it was when that they pressed in to claim new territory that this led to war. And this made me thinking about how this idea of the war and the claims on the territory are intersected with ecology and the movement of things. Because if there's one thing about these mountains is not only are they moving, but they insist for survival, people need to keep moving through them. And then you end up with this kind of distinct tension between how a state functions and how the mountains function. So at its most basic level, a state provides safety, maybe, for some people at least, in exchange for it restricts the movement of people and it taxes them. And it establishes those this ability to function between through infrastructure. And that usually is in two types. You have what we call soft infrastructure, which is things like setting up school systems, recognizing people's censuses and things like that. And then you have hard or material infrastructure like roads and schools and bridges and dams and so on. And this and to do this, states need to be in charge of territory, and the ocean and the mountains, like oceans, they're really, really problematic for states to set themselves up and establish clear borders and to exercise their influence. And from amongst mountains, areas that are hard to govern and hard to control, I would argue that the Himalayas are maybe the worst. They've got everything that a state doesn't want in a boundary area. So they have trans-mountain watersheds, that's like rivers that cross over them. They have really high altitudes. The biodiversity is difficult to negotiate within it. So we're talking about not just civets spreading disease, but if you move up one area, then the entire ecosystem, you move up a kilometer, the entire ecosystem can change. And as I said, they're dependent on movement. In order to survive in these mountains, people have needed to move to get new agriculture, animals need to move, and water, the rivers coursing through them, they also need to move. And not only that, as I'm going to show you, the mountains themselves move. They're not still. People have this idea of them being, rocks that don't move, but these are really dynamic rocks. And in this way, I want to borrow an idea from a friend of mine, Alex Davis, where he talks about these mountains being a key actor in the geopolitics of this region. And I also want to add to that by saying that there's an exchange going on, because in the Anthropocene, not only are the mountains an actor geopolitically, but humans are becoming an actor on the mountains. We're affecting the ecological and geological systems. In order to give you an understanding of this, I kind of have to introduce you to the mountains. And so this story of being introduced to the mountains starts 60 million years ago. So I said I was going to give you the backstory. You probably didn't think I was going to talk about a 60 million year backstory, but this is like mountain time. If you're talking about things in mountain time, you have to take a bigger scope and think about things from a much wider, much longer temporal capacity, or in a much longer temporal sphere. So the Himalaya started being created about 60 million years ago, and they're created by a collision of tectonic plates when the Indian plate broke away from Australia, actually, and started moving north, and then slammed into the Eurasian state and started pushing underneath it. And the collision pushed up rocks and water and eroded, and you end up with this kind of circle of mud going between the plate pushing the mountains up, the water eroding the mountains and bringing it down, and they create these alluvial plains at their base. I'm using this image to show you because I just love it, and I'm a historian, so every time I get an old map of something, I really like it. And this was drawn by a geologist who was a draftsperson as well as a geologist in the 1960s and 70s when they were figuring out how tectonic plates move. But I also have a video. And so I really like this video because it shows you how it worked and how things are still dynamic, but it wasn't fiery enough. And that's the thing with these mountains. They really, when these things crush together, there was all this fire come out. So I had to use this other picture as well to give you a sense of, this isn't just dynamic in terms of movement, it's dynamic in terms of heat release. There's a hot water, there's hot springs throughout these mountains. There's different types of metals, and there's constant movement. Whoa, before I get to the constant movement, I also found this out the other day, and I thought, everyone's in lockdown, it's depressing. I have to give you a fun fact about the geology of the mountains. So we don't just talk, because most of this talk is pretty depressing, I guess. But this one isn't so depressing. This is kind of cool. And this is where science can be really fun. And this is why I've been writing a lot about the Mount Everest's geological makeup and the people that found it out. And I found this amazing thing that because we talked about the sea being pushed up, so the top of Mount Everest is actually used to be the bottom of the Tethys Sea. And when they've been analyzing it, they found that the inside that crystallized rock at the top of Mount Everest is that not just crustaceans that used to live at the bottom of the ocean, but also their feces. How cool is that? So in this image on the right, there's got like a P I decided the P, there was another word for it, but I've decided it stands for poo because so you get this, all the way to the top of, that's my fun fact, at the top of the Everest, the top layer of rock on Jomolungma or Everest is fossilized poo. But now we've got to get back to depressing stuff. Right, yes, because these mountains have not, this is not an old story. The geological formation of these mountains isn't something that happened in the late past and has stopped now. They are still moving. The Indian plate moves north at about 4 to 10 centimeters a year. And this usually comes in, this movement comes in shudders. So you have mega earthquakes the whole way through this region constantly, but also, as I said, thermal activity, which intersects with permafrost and landslides. Someone sent me this yesterday, so I thought I'd show you it. This is the kind of thing that you see. I mean, I haven't seen anything quite like that, but I've seen other landslides as I was traveling around the area. And you really get a sense when you're being there that this is a dynamic space and not one that you would, that you feel like is as still as it appears on most maps. So in that process, the mountains created a whole bunch of things that I wanted to run through quickly. The first thing they created was in their formation. They created a monsoon system, which means the water goes up and comes back. We'll talk about that in a second. They created a third pole, which is a big chunk of ice, the third biggest on the planet, which sits atop the mountains. And from this combination of monsoons and ice, they created 9 large perennial rivers that are perennial because there's ice and snowmelt part of the year and monsoon rains the rest of the year. And these rivers drag down mud so that you end up with a situation of alluvial plains with perennial rivers. And these were fantastic for humans who were really river creatures when you think about it, to come and settle here. And we ended up with half of humanity, almost half of humanity living in these 9 large river areas around the Tibetan Plateau and the mountains. And this is probably the place on Earth where you have a massive humanity right next to an intensely different socio-ecosystem. Most of the time when we've had like colonization or change, or people going from one ecosystem to another, they've had to cross a large ocean to do it. But here you get people being able to get in a car and drive 20 minutes, and they're in a completely different ecosystem. This geological big pushy shovey, I can't think of another word for it at the moment, is also created a lot of metals which are now highly prized. And with the altitude came this intense biodiversity, which has its generally good side, but can have a downside for humans. See previous conversation about civets and their role in spreading SARS. Oh, well, in transmitting SARS to us. So the first thing just to quickly run through is these monsoons. The monsoons are all over South, Southeast and East Asia. They all work with the Tibetan Plateau. When you have changes in ice on the Tibetan Plateau, that affects this entire convection system. So it's really, it plays an important role in delivering all of this water and mud to all of the people. Second thing is the ice pole. It's not just the ice that you see in this region, but there is also a massive permafrost in the region that stabilizes climates, but also will be affected by changes, anthropomorphic changes. The rivers, that's the third thing I talked about, the rivers. These rivers stretch everywhere from Afghanistan, Central Asia, the Amur Darya, all the way through Pakistan, the Ganga, the Brahmaputra, Irrawaddy, Salween, Mekong, Yangtze and Yellow, all the way up to Beijing. All of these rivers sources come from this one area, which makes it, that they talk about it being the water tower of Asia is one way of putting it. And this idea of a massive humanity. So according to the World Economic Forum, and this was based on a geographer's work, more people live in that circle than out. And if I click between these, you can see that there's a lot of connection between those two. These rivers are like, they deliver food and water, or water and mud, to a big chunk of humanity. The metals, this isn't just traditional metals that are in the region around Tibet, like silver and gold, but also we're increasingly seeing mining for rare earth metals that will be a large part of the coming energy systems when we switch to batteries. And biodiversity. So there's some arguments about whether it's a good idea to talk about biodiversity hotspots. But because people can think that it doesn't matter if we don't look after the rest of the planet. But in terms of like saying where there is biodiversity, the Himalaya itself is an intensely biodiverse place, but it's also next to 3 others, the mountains of Central Asia, Southwest China, and Indo-Burma. This is a place where there's all kinds of animals, but also bugs and plant species. So how did humans deal with this really varied climate and environment? They basically did it by moving. This is how they did it. And if you remember back, I was saying states don't like movement. Well, the only way that they managed to survive here for thousands of years was through movement, and it had different ways of doing it. They either moved with animals. So we have moving animals as well who also need to move across plains. So there's yaks up in the, I hope it's your right-hand corner. They're also moved in terms of moving their agriculture with the Swidden agriculture, which you can see down in the bottom left. This is in the grassy mountains on the south side of Everest. So that means I'd put a silver circle around a field that's in the middle of a forest, so you can see how this works. So they cut a field, and then when that's used up, they'd move on to the next one, and that would grow back because it's such a fertile area on the south side of these mountains. And in the drier plains of Tibet, then they used redirected water from the flowing rivers into their fields and set up irrigated agricultural spaces. But even then, there was a lot more movement between sites of fields than that you would have thought in most other places. And what this meant then was that the states that developed in these regions adapted to this. They weren't the same kind of really forced I'd say thick states, for want of a better way of putting it. And I'm drawing a lot, when I talk about this, I'm drawing on the work of James Scott. So and it occurred to me, it's like there's states, but not as you know it. So he always talks about this idea of seeing like non-state spaces in the mountains and state spaces in valleys. And this is kind of in between, because you had states, but they were really flexible. So they were multi-layered, overlapping, religious and temporal. So people could pay taxes to one place and then to another one would protect them, or they'd say the land belongs to one monastery, but I pay taxes to the central government. But it was a state. So from the 17th century, the Dalai Lama was the head of government. They did treaties with other people. It just functioned in a different way. And I'm skipping over a whole bunch of history here because it's, this isn't why we're here, but there were these kind of flexible, I just want to alert you to the fact that there were these flexible states in this space, not just in Tibet, but also in Nepal. And they interacted with bigger empires like the Mongol emperor, and the Manchu were there and had strange relationships, they were unconventional relationships with the Tibetan state, or the Tibetan states, to be more precise. But then came the British, and I don't know how many times as a historian you go, oh, it was okay, and then the British came. Anyway, the British showed up and started doing some weird stuff through the mountains. And basically, they started pushing in. They were in India, and they started pushing into the mountains in the late 1700s. And this is, again, another really complicated story, which I've been researching a lot. And there's a lot of people with moustaches talking about natives. It's really weird and a bit annoying. So they all were traveling around this area. They kind of went in as expeditions. They didn't stay there. This is the thing, the states we were talking about with the Dalai Lama and the Nepali state, they were focused in that area, but the British came and went. They went in expeditions and they left. They came in summer and they left in winter. It was very much a go in and get the people to do what you want and then leave. They bullied or created treaties with Bhutan in 1775, Nepal 1815, and Sikkim in 1861. And this kind of established these kingdoms, which were along the southern side of the Himalaya, as independent states. They took over Jammu and Kashmir, which in turn had taken over Ladakh in 1846. And then they had this thing where they wanted to trade with Tibet and to fix a border between Tibet and their empire, because they had this idea that if you created a border, then it was easier to trade across it, right? So in some ways, if you have a settled border, the border becomes less of a thing than if you don't. So they wanted to know about these spaces so that they could control them, but they really struggled to do so in the Himalaya because there wasn't, as we were saying before, right, these mountains are really difficult for states to get their heads around. And I'm drawing here on some really excellent work by Kyle Gardner, who's been looking at how these borders were set out in Ladakh. And what he found was that the British went in to try and survey it and set it out so that you would have a border that sat at a watershed, but these watersheds were so complicated and the mountains were so high that they couldn't establish the border. So then they basically ended up with blank spaces or multiple lines on their maps and no fixed border. It was the geology of the place and the hydrology of the place defeated them. At the same time, as you had the British coming up from the south, and this is something that I guess we're used to the British being settlers, we're less probably used to the idea of the Qing Empire being a settler state, but that was actually what was happening in the west, in the west of China, the borderlands between China and Tibet. Again, I'm drawing on some really excellent scholarship of Scott Relia and Yudru Tsumo, who have been looking at this practice of settlement in the area during the Qing time. And Scott in particular has found examples of diaries in which the people who were doing the settling in this area said specifically that they were imitating the British. And if the British could do be a settler state, why couldn't they? So they were pushing in up from the east into Tibet. And there was a rebellion in 1905, which was crushed. And then so 1905, there was a rebellion. And we remember there was an expedition by the British into Tibet, the Young Husband expedition. So after this, the Qing state sent in the ex-governor of Sichuan, Zhao Erfeng, and he basically, he was known as the butcher of Butcher Zhao by the Tibetans, and his people then started this kind of game of like a plant the flag game along the border areas in the east. And this has been Berenice Guillot-Richard, and I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. She did amazing work setting out how there was this kind of fight for territory between the British and the Qing in the east. But the Qing fell really fast, 1911, as soon as quickly after Zhao Feng had gone into this area, and he was unfortunately decapitated by the people working for him in Sichuan as he went back down towards China. And there was this kind of imperial space left, which the Republican Chinese didn't really feel even conceptually. So the British were like, okay, we still need a border. So they set up to have a conference at Shimla in 1913, where they produced, in a very British way, a map stating where the border should be between everyone. And the Chinese, Republican Chinese delegate said, no, I'm not accepting this. The Tibetans signed it. And we have images of this map here showing where they signed it. And this was the chief surveyor's name was McMahon, so it became known as the McMahon line. But it's really interesting because if you read British Tibetan documents after this, they're kind of like, oh yeah, we signed it to get rid of them. We didn't actually accept it. And then after that, they kept pushing across this line and getting taxes from people on the other side of the line. And at the same time as the Tibetans are ignoring them and the British aren't really paying that much attention, the Republican Chinese discourse was still focused on the idea that they owned this area. So Sun Yat-sen's map that he created in the 1920s, I don't know if you can see it, but it has a train line going down to the plains of Assam. So this was, the Chinese were definitely engaging in this kind of British fantasy map making, and the idea that you could build a train line down through that territory is even now impossible. So this map of his was not real, it was science fiction. It was really not going to happen that time, and it'd be even hard now. But the Chinese state took on this idea of that being their space when they into the next era. And so then you had this is all the backup to this war in 1962. But there's another thing that happens before this, which I think doesn't get enough of a Guernsey when we talk about history. And that is the fact that in 1947, the Republic of India was founded. In 1949, the Republic of China was founded. And these two things are probably, they're so close together, they're like twins in a way, that it's a profound part of our world history that doesn't get talked about as much as, say, other things like the French Revolution or whatever. This was a transformative place, and they came at those times through very different means and very different personalities. So on the Indian side, you'd had a century-long Satyagraha, which is this struggle for truth, and a pacifist movement against British imperialism. And on the Chinese side, you'd had war after war after war, and they had a revolution in which many people were killed in order to get to this founding of the People's Republic of China. They had a civil war, then they had the Japanese war, and then they had another civil war after that. So that's a very different headspace to be coming at this place, coming to the mountains with. So in the 1950s, both countries were mainly focused on their population centers, and they had this idea of self-determination, meaning, I still don't understand this, but self-determination meant to them that they could inherit imperial boundaries and still be post-colonial, right? I don't know how that works. And as I said, these were kind of imaginary imperial boundaries. So from that, the People's Liberation invaded Tibet and took over, and India was fighting wars mainly with Pakistan, but the Pakistani forces entered Ladakh and it was partitioned, but they were slowly moving towards the borderlands. And Nehru was really interested in this idea of the non-aligned movement. It was the Cold War. He was friends with the US and the USSR, and he wanted to practice this idea that he called Hindi Chini Bye Bye, which is like China and India are brothers. But he was slowly pushing into these border regions as well, making deals with the Ladakhi aristocrats. And after the 1950 earthquake, remember I talked about earthquakes and how important they were, a massive earthquake in Assam and Tibet in 1950, and India pushed in and gained the locals' trust by giving them aid. Things came to a head after there was an uprising in Tibet in 1959, and the Dalai Lama and lots of people fled from Tibet into exile, lots of other Tibetans, and this kind of showed that I would say that the majority of Tibetans in this area, given a choice, I mean, they did have their own place, but given a choice, would have chosen India over China. India, 1960, there was a boundary commission that failed. India had a forward policy. Russia, I'm skipping over this because I don't know, you can read about this and I don't think it's the most interesting part. The Cuban Missile Crisis, after that, Russia said they'd back China's invasion. China built a road in, and then the war happened in from October to, October to November. They entered in through 4 different valleys. Now, this sounds like if you say China and India had a war in the Himalaya, then people have this idea that it was a massive front. But we have to think about the mountains and how much actual space they took up. So I mapped in the eastern area the valleys that they came through when they were fighting this war, and that's it. Yeah, the red one was where they came down. There's 2 red ones where they came down. There's 3 other passageways that they could have used that they didn't. The only spaces that they invaded and held were red. That is a massive gap in between these. So you see, even at this stage, they still weren't controlling the region. After this, however, there was a push. This is when this area was colonized, after that war. You had on the Chinese side, collectivization, famine, Cultural Revolution. India had famines, small famines, but was both sides treated this area with a certain degree of dismissiveness and treated the people from that area. They designated them as tribes or minzu and treated them as backwards and to be kind of studied. Well, and then so that kind of held, there was a holding pattern until the 80s. But then after this, because there was this gaping wound of this unresolved border and this idea that they were in uncharted territory. So that they from the 90s, when they both became, both India and China, particularly China, became richer, they intensified their state-making enterprises in this region. And now they weren't just set on stopping people moving across the disputed border, but they also started to make water and animals, harder for water and animals to move across the border. People hadn't been able to cross as nomads or to hunt since the 1962 war, but now they were doing lots of dams and also factory farming and national parks, mining, and they had road and rail coming in, but not crossing these borders. So you get this kind of fanning out from both sides. And that made this area into not just a state-made border from China and India, but a capitalist frontier where people could go in there to exploit the indigenous peoples or the people of the area's wealth and resources. And on top of this, beforehand, the British only had, Sun Yat-sen and the British only had maps through which they could imagine things. But now, because we have all of this satellite technology, the border has become more fixed technologically speaking, and people can track down to where it's going and argue over where on a mountain it is. And in the last few years, we've also seen, because of technology and because of this ability to fix things, we've seen an all-weather occupation. I mean, a lot of what was going on in Galwan and Doklam could be seen as being a switch particularly on the Chinese side, from having fair weather fighting to all weather fighting. So I'm just about to finish up by thinking about where that takes us from here. And I'm afraid it's not as cheery as the fact that there's fossilized poo at the top of Mount Everest, right? Because with this fixed idea and with that bifurcated region in such an important part of the world, we've got some big issues to deal with. One of these is if you have a combination of what they're doing is moving encouraging intensive animal farming, and then having national parks for security reasons and biodiversity protection. But what that actually means is that you don't get a spread of animals across the area, and we're having a lead into so FMD is foot and mouth disease, and PPR is, let's just call it goat plague, that's happening across this region, and it crosses borders. And when you don't have a good clean border and treaties, it can spread. And as you can see, this is where if the zoonotic diseases are most likely to come from. So this is, a biological issue that we need to deal with. I'm running out of time, but yeah, I had videos of Tibetans working with in fish farms on the region, and the diseased goats from these goat plague outbreaks. It's really intense there. Well, yes, and we've also got this. We've also got tensions rising lately because the China ramped up the. Has started approaching the Tibetan Plateau more as a technological experiment, and they've said that they're going to create a massive power station at the lower levels, the lower reaches of the Yalong Tsampo, right on the border of India. Then India said it was going to build an equally large dam just south of there. And so if we have earthquakes and this sediment and this movement through this area happening, and they're trying to fix massive dams on either side, it really is like a massive experiment with a lot of people's lives dependent on it, that we don't know what's going to happen there. And to add to all of this place isn't getting colder. We've got the Himalaya are experiencing climate change at 2 to 3 times higher than anywhere else on the planet, than the global average. Now this threat of climate change is leading to increase in all of the issues apart from earthquakes that we talked about before. So it's an increase in landslides, it's an increase in the risk of zoonotic disease transfer. It's a threat to livelihoods and also to the infrastructure that's being built in the region. So the concluding idea then is it's enough already. This argument about this border is really a problem at this point, when we have when this area is so important to so many people, and including specifically the Indigenous peoples of the region. And the idea of the nation state isn't something that's older than the mountains. The mountains are older than this, but we really need to move past this war, move past these arguments about the borders, and start looking at the multiple healths of the region through its human and animal and environmental circuits, and through the 3 different types of health that were in One Health that I talked about at the beginning. So I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I mean, such a fascinating and rich presentation. I mean, I've learned a lot about a range of issues, the way that you bring together the environmental, the strategic, the political, the cultural. I mean, absolutely fascinating. I'm going to start with the questions. So please, I see we've got a few questions in the Q&A already, but I want to begin with one for you. This is going to be, I'm sure this won't surprise you, but this will be an international relations focused question for you.
No, you don't want to ask me about geology? Not even the poo? Come on. All right.
Well, I mean, I find it really interesting. Are you talking about environments that are hard to govern and to control and to even map? And that, this puts pressure on a kind of Westphalian state system that's very much about territoriality, about having exclusive state sovereignty within defined borders. You mentioned the oceans, and of course the high seas have often been described as a global commons. They haven't been able to create boundaries, and that's something that is a relatively modern invention in law of the sea. So I'm wondering then about whether we need new modes of governance or new modes of thinking about authority or legislation or regulation within these areas that are particularly tricky to manage? I mean, is it important, like, should there be no borders, or should there be very clear borders, I guess is a question that I'm kind of wanting you to provide some answers on.
In some ways, if you have a really clear border, most of the time the border disappears, right? It enables like flows across the border. Yeah, so I was going to say in Australia we have borders, but that didn't work out so well for us at the moment. But you know, it tends to be, you know, you perform the border, and if there's no arguments about it, the tension around the borders tends to disappear. And this is not what's happening here. I mean, and the thing is that it seems to me that the discussions about this tend to get stuck in the Westphalian model, and I don't think it's necessarily helpful. There is nowhere, maybe the Amazon, there's hardly anywhere else on the planet that has such an impact on places. And it's like I feel like the Westphalian, well, it seems to me, I shouldn't feel like, it seems to me the Westphalian model is killing the Himalayan. And the only way I can think of to describe it, it's impacting the water, it's impacting the animals, it's the things that it's done to the people of that region is just outrageous. So it's kind of, how do we move beyond that? And if it's people, it would be great. Like if I ruled the world, which I don't think would be great because I can't answer all my emails. But if there was like if it was like big sky thinking, right? You would have like something more like the Arctic or the Antarctic, or maybe the Arctic's better, where you have like a council and you have Indigenous people who have a presence on that council and their voices can be heard. Yeah, that would be ideal, and I think we really need to have that. But at least figure out what's going on here. Like come up with a clear border and develop cross-border ways of managing water, ways of managing disease spread, ways of managing conservation fast. Yeah, because this is really pressing. It's really pressing on this region.
Absolutely. Now we have quite a few questions to get through, so I'm actually just going to read them out directly. But we have one from Ian Sadler, which is about this idea as a nationalist problem. And it's similar to the one that I just said. Does it mean that a world government must take over from nation states?
So in that case, is it that it's like the answer to a large authoritarian states is larger states? I'm not sure. I would like it to be, it would make more sense to me to be devolved. And that's why I think it's fascinating as a historian to look back and see, I mean, it wasn't that it was great, you know, there was slave trading between some of these states in the area, but the impacts on the region were much less when you had a kind of a looser, more anarchic state in the region that could respond, because you may need to move people and you may need to move with animals or to move when the water changes in these areas. So if you can move towards that idea of a looser alliance rather than an extra layer, I think that would probably be best.
So we have a question in here from Niraj Nanda from the South Asia Times, which is about the conflict seeming to be endless. So what solutions do you see as being possible, maybe short or long-term solutions?
Well, this is why I find it fascinating to me that there, and I keep thinking this is about emotion. There's a woman who called Chatterjee Miller who was talking about how there's so much about the humiliation that India and China experienced during the colonial era that feeds into how they're looking at this conflict. And I keep seeing this because there's no logic. And as a historian, there is no historical evidence for them being there. These maps were made up. Like they weren't there. They didn't know anything. They don't make any sense. So there clearly were people living in the ground that had different complex relationships with the place, but these maps were imposed. So in some ways, it's almost like, how do we get to the stage where we make China and India recognize the pain and the hurt of that previous experience, and then figure out a way not to pass it on to the next person, you know what I mean? And in some ways it's also complicated because, like, as the West, we need to shut up really, because, you know, us telling either China or India you shouldn't be invading other places and colonizing them and taking their resources is a bit rich. So I don't know, it's some way of finding the space for that emotion to be understood in a way, I think, but I'm not quite, I don't have I don't know how you do that. I just think it needs to be recognized.
So we have a question here about just a clarification on your central thesis. Is it that the current claims are driven more by water and resource control than a historical interest in people and the territory itself?
No, I think that they are both happening. I think that that's an either or that doesn't work, right? I think that these two countries were dreaming nations before they existed. And the dream included territory they knew nothing about. It was a fantasy, yeah? But that doesn't mean that people aren't invested in that fantasy. And then once you're invested in a fantasy, then you start finding ways to make it more important to you. So I think that the access to the kind of exploitation, and it's not just, it's the exploitation of the resources from this region, which we have to recognize is being done on other people's land. You know, these weren't terra nullius. Right, so that kind of attachment to that idea, I think, is driving the exploitation of the resources and the clinging to those regions. People in China, when they talk about Tibet, they don't say, "Oh, it has water and it has metal." They say things like, "Losing Tibet would be like losing my liver." Yeah, and when people talk about the Himalaya from India, they talk about the blood of people that's fallen on the fields, and you go there and you see people praying at these memorials. It's much more visceral than it is just about resources. But I think the viscerality and the resources kind of blend together to create a kind of toxic potion.
And it also seems like there's this kind of great power status that feeds in, like not compromising on sovereign and territorial integrity, or the vision that these states have about where their boundaries lie, because compromising on sovereignty is
what happened with
demonstration of a weak state.
It's what, and there's a legacy of it as well, right? It's
So, I mean, just on that, there's a question here about whether or not China and India share your concerns. It seems like they might not. So how do you, or how does the international community, or those who are concerned about, particularly around the environmental issues, get them to be concerned about this issue? And I guess this is really a question about part of the moving away from a sovereign state system probably relies on the sovereign states to do that, and they probably are not very interested in doing that.
I think part of it, well, okay, I know where I've got a plan, right? So so first of all, we need to get our heads past discussing whether climate change is an issue and figure out how we adjust to climate change. Because what we're seeing play out on the Chinese side of this border is the Chinese state stepping up and trying to deal with climate change. But their way of dealing with climate change is by having massive hydro projects and mining out this area and doing stuff that's very kind of engineering technology rather than taxes over this entire area, which is actually a massive experiment, right? But we're too busy having another argument that's like 20th century argument, and we haven't caught up yet. So if we could get that crap out of the road and then start talking about how we're actually going to do this in a sustainable way. Like, so I have this really clear image in my head of a massive dam in Tibet that had a sign on it that said, massive concrete dam with a concrete factory next to it that said, clean energy, low carbon. I was like, oh no. So there's so we need to get over ourselves and start having the next conversation, and then we can actually engage with the efforts that China is actually making when we're pretty useless. Yeah. Is that a start?
Well, it's hard to disagree. I mean, I think that part of it is how we conceptualize security as well, at least in an international relations sense. You know, climate change is an existential security threat.
Yes, very much.
And there is a question here about whether the ecological problem might be too big for mere humans at present and might eventually be decided by the mountains.
Yes, I think The mountains will outlast us, I'm pretty sure. And the way we're going, they will outlast us for a long time. Yeah, which is but I don't know, we are even having an impact on the mountains through the kind of the pollution on the ice and transforming the rivers and so on. I don't know, humans our survival instinct will eventually kick in, is my guess. But it would be great if we could kind of get over the whole like state-centered Westphalian idea and get over the whole like wounds from a sad war from 70 years ago and do it quicker so we don't lose any more people or any more livelihoods. Yeah.
So just a final, we might have time for one or two, I guess we'll see, but a question about the Belt and Road Initiative. Is that playing into, for example, the building of the dams? Is that having an effect on India-China border relations?
So I have a friend called Galen Merton who's been doing this really interesting work on maps, and he said it's a strange thing that the maps of the Belt and Road kind of jump over the Tibetan Plateau and they have big gaps there, which is weird. Because they do actually have projects that are in this region, and there's some of Sun Yat-sen's trains are finally trying to be made, like down into Nepal and then down into Pakistan, because the Himalaya goes all the way to Afghanistan, right? So some of it's playing into the Belt and Road, but I do think that there's another level to this and it makes a distinction between what China's doing and what India's doing, and that India is still operating on this land and treasure type approach to the Himalaya, whereas China seems to be approaching it. I was fascinated by the way that they put this construction of a dam in their space travel section of the fire. Yeah, so there's this idea that going up into this mountain region is a kind of a technological leap. And they're approaching that slightly differently to the mass construction type of approach of the Belt and Road. Yeah.
Interesting. Now I think we've got one. This is an interesting question from our friend Pradeep at the University of Melbourne. Hi, Pradeep. Wants to know, why did you get interested in this? What were you doing in Dharamshala as a young person?
Right. Okay. So basically, I don't know. I guess I grew up in Queensland, and I was pretty miserable, and I was like 17, and I thought, I'm leaving. I remember having my first plane ticket. I saved up and went overseas when I was 18, and I just kept going back to the mountains. After living there for a bit, I tried to make a movie. I just kept coming back from when I was like 18. So I think it was. I liked being in India better than I liked being in Queensland.
It was a slightly different environment.
Yeah, very different. Yeah, very different. I was blown away by the mountains. I literally, the first time I saw them, I remember this man said to me, "Oh, you can see the mountains," and I lifted my head like that, and I couldn't see anything, because my idea of mountains was things that you lifted your head this far, and he put his head under my chin and went like I had to look right up into the sky, and I was like, oh my God. Yes, love mountains. Yeah.
Well, hopefully you'll be able to get back to your beloved mountains sometime in the future. I mean, you do have your newly minted ARC DECRA Fellow, and no doubt there's a lot of travel in your budget that hopefully you'll be able to get to do in the future. But thank you so much for giving us the time. Super interesting and insightful as always, and we're really grateful that you've been able to join us. At the same time next week, we will be hearing from another one of our La Trobe Uni colleagues, Dr Kiran Shind, on heritage sites and tourism in India. I've no doubt that's going to be another really fascinating seminar. So that's Thursday, 2nd of September at 2 p.m. AEST. In the meantime, please keep an eye out for our emails or follow us on Twitter at Trobe Asia. You can follow me at Beck Striding. You can follow Ruth at Water the Planet, and you'll find more information as it becomes available on our Twitter feed. But thank you once again, Ruth, and thank you to our audience for joining us. It was really, really very interesting.